Elias Kane hadn't planned to stop in the town of Dustmere that morning. The sun was already high and mean, and he had cattle waiting at the ridge. But something pulled him there a wrong turn, maybe. Or fate disguised as a dry wind. The market was unusually crowded, buzzing like flies over a carcass. A commotion was forming near the iron gates of the auction yard. He saw them then. 3 women, barefoot, bound at the wrists with rusted iron chains, standing taller than anyone else in the yard. Their hair was braided with bark and bone, their clothes stitched from hide and storm, not fabric. The crowd pressed back like the women carried plague, and maybe to the fearful they did. But Elias saw something else. Around each of their necks hung squirrel-tail pendants, wild, bushy, and unmistakably Ayani. A detail that struck him like thunder. 5 years ago, he'd been left for dead in the belly of a river, swept away by a flood after trying to save his father. The memory was buried deep beneath the weight of shame and silence. He had been weak, desperate, and someone had pulled him out. 3 women, with hands rough like tree bark, eyes like fire behind fog. They never spoke his language, they didn't stay long, but they saved his life. He remembered the pendants they wore even more clearly than their faces. Now they were here, caged, sold. The auctioneer, a pale man with a whiskey voice, barked a number so high it drew laughter. No one bid. Witches, someone whispered. Man-eaters, another spat. Filthy. Elias's jaw clenched. He looked down at his wrist, the gold watch his father had given him when he was 12. The last thing he still owned from the old man. A relic of a man who drank too much, fought too hard, but never broke a promise. Elias removed it slowly, held it up. "I'll take them," he said. His voice didn't shake. The auctioneer's smile faltered. The crowd murmured. Some laughed. But no one stopped him. He didn't buy slaves that day. He reclaimed a moment that had never let him sleep soundly since. A life debt. And something else, something deeper that his heart understood before his mind could name it. As he approached the gate to collect them, one of the women stepped forward, the tallest. A scar traced her brow like a ceremonial knife had kissed her once and left her marked forever. She didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't beg. But when she looked at him, something ancient stirred inside Elias. "Do you remember me?" he wanted to ask. But instead, he unlocked the chains himself. The jailer tried to protest. Elias's hand brushed his revolver. That was enough. The crowd scattered. On the ride back to his ranch, the silence was more haunting than any storm. The 3 women sat in the back of the wagon unmoving. Elias didn't look back often. He was afraid. Not of them, but of what their presence stirred in him. Memories he'd locked away and a question that boiled inside. What happened to them after they saved me? When they arrived at the ranch, Elias didn't bring them into his home. He gave them the old shearing cabin near the east field, unlocked, stocked with water and blankets. He said nothing, just pointed, then walked away. That night he couldn't sleep. The moon cut his window like a knife. He kept seeing them, those eyes, the scar, the silent fire. What had the world done to them between then and now? On the second morning, he found a small object on his porch, a carved bone shaped like a forked river. His breath caught, the sign. He stared out toward the cabin. Nayeli, the tall one with the scar, stood in the doorway. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. But she nodded once. And Elias knew. She remembered everything. But there was something else in her gaze that chilled him. Something broken, yet burning. It wasn't just memory. It was war. And in that moment, Elias understood. The women he brought home weren't victims. They were survivors of something worse than water or fire. Something human. He swore then and there that he would never let the world touch them again. If this story struck something inside you, maybe a memory, a question, or even just a chill, you're not alone. If you believe no soul should be sold in chains, drop a 1 in the comments. If you felt that moment Elias raised his father's watch, go ahead and tap that like. And if you're wondering what happened to the sisters next, don't go far. Their fire is just beginning to rise, because this isn't a Western. This is a reckoning. The nights grew colder after the sisters arrived, not in temperature, but in something else, something that clung to the walls of the ranch house like smoke. Elias barely slept. He took to sitting outside, shotgun across his lap, staring at the dark cabin near the east field. He wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid for them, and of what he might learn if he asked the wrong question. On the 4th night it rained, a slow, whispering rain that dripped through the barn roof and pooled in the cattle troughs. Just before dawn, the door to the cabin creaked open. Sierra, the middle sister, stepped into the yard barefoot in the mud, clutching something tight to her chest. Her hands shook. She didn't speak, just dropped to her knees and began clawing at the earth. Elias approached but stopped when he saw what she held. It was a child's tunic, torn, blood-stained, too small for any of the sisters. Her face crumpled as she buried it in the wet soil, whispering in a language only grief could understand. When she looked up, her eyes burned not with sadness but with fury. Elias had seen that fire before in men right before a killing, but in Sierra it was older, deeper. It was the kind of fury that didn't go away when blood was spilled. It waited. By morning, all three sisters stood before Elias. Nayeli stepped forward. She had changed. No longer silent, no longer still. She pointed to the carved river fork above his door, then drew a symbol in the dirt. 3 hills. A broken circle. Elias recognized it. It was the old border of the tribal hunting grounds. Lands now swallowed by cattle barons and private militias. Lands rumored to be cursed. Then came the names. Cartwright, Barlow, Singer. Names Elias hadn't heard in years, but hadn't forgotten either. Men who called themselves ranchers but dealt in something far darker. Slave trade, forced removal, secret markets operating under army blind eyes. Names linked to massacres no one dared investigate. Names spoken only in whispers because saying them loud was a good way to vanish. Tama, the youngest, unwrapped a bundle from beneath her tunic. Inside was a piece of metal bent burnt, etched with a symbol Elias recognized with dread. The same insignia branded on cattle by Barlow's men. But this wasn't a livestock brand. It had been torn from someone's flesh. The silence cracked open something in Elias. He stood paced to the edge of the porch, gripping the railing until it groaned beneath his fists. His mind raced. His gut boiled. He remembered the first time he saw one of Barlow's so-called caravans passing through dustmere wagons covered with tarps that stank of blood and piss. He remembered doing nothing. "I should have stopped them back then," he muttered. Nayeli shook her head. "You stop them now." Something had shifted. The sisters weren't just passing through. They were returning, not as survivors, as witnesses and weapons. And Elias understood. Whatever came next wouldn't be about rescue. It would be war. They left at dusk. No words, just silent preparations. Horses saddled under a bleeding sky, rifles wrapped in cloth blades strapped to thighs. The cattle were restless, like they knew something ancient was waking. Elias tightened the saddle on Belle, his oldest mare, and glanced at the sisters. Nayeli stood by the gate, hair braided high, eyes fixed on the horizon like she could already see the blood. He hadn't asked where they were going. He didn't need to. The circle Sierra had drawn in the mud, the names spoken like curses, it all pointed to one place, the old dry hollow ridge. Once a sacred valley, now a scar of burned earth guarded by Cartwright's dogs. The journey took 2 days across unforgiving terrain. Scrubland turned to rocky cuts and abandoned fencing twisted like the ribs of something dead. They traveled by night, rested under brush during the day. The second morning, Elias woke to find Tama kneeling in a clearing, staring at a line of ants devouring a dead horned lizard. She whispered a prayer he didn't understand, then crushed the lizard's skull with a flat stone. "This land remembers," she said, "even if men try to silence it." By sunset, the stench hit them. Rot, smoke, grease, and something fouler like fear that had been bottled too long. From the ridge, they saw it, the compound. Barbed wire, tall floodlights and cages, dozens of them. Some held wild mustangs, some held people. On a platform at the center stood Barlow himself. White suit, dirtied at the cuffs, holding a whip and talking loud for no reason. He laughed like a man who thought God was deaf. Around him, men drank from tin mugs, rifles slung low, chewing tobacco and arrogance. And below the platform, chained, bruised, stripped of dignity, were the girls, not women. Girls. Elias felt his teeth grind so hard his jaw locked. The rage was no longer abstract. It had a face now, a smell, a sound. Sierra crouched beside him, lifted a strip of cloth. Painted on it with crushed berries and ash were 3 curved lines, symbols for vengeance. She tied it around her forehead and passed 2 more to her sisters. Then she looked at Elias. "We don't need your pity," she said, "only your aim." He nodded. No hesitation. At midnight, they moved. Thomas slipped into the eastern fence line, cutting it low with a blade made from deer bone. Sierra circled left through the stacked hay carts near the holding pens. Nayeli, silent as fog, took the ridge with Elias, their rifles aimed at the bonfire below. He watched her breathe, calm, controlled, like she'd been born for this moment. The first shot came from Elias. It tore through a guard's lantern, plunging the southern yard into chaos. Then Nayeli fired straight through the throat of the man by the cages. Screams, shouts, boots stomping. Then the sisters descended. Tama moved like lightning blade flashing through flesh. She freed the first cage, lifted a girl no older than 13, Arwa, and shoved her toward the shadows. Sierra lit a torch and hurled it into the haystack. Fire roared. Barlow shouted orders too late. His men fired into the dark, missing shadows that moved like ghosts. One by one, cages opened. One by one, rage spilled into the dirt. And in the thick of it, Elias found Cartwright, hiding in a storage tent, pistol shaking in his hand. The same man who once bid for tribal goods at the auction. Elias grabbed him by the collar and threw him into the dirt. "You remember their names now?" he growled. Cartwright whimpered. Elias didn't shoot. He just left him there, tied, gagged, and surrounded by the very people he'd once chained. Justice didn't need bullets tonight, only witnesses. When the dust settled, cages were empty. The compound burned. But something greater had ignited revolution. The compound burned for 3 days. Smoke curled into the clouds like a funeral chant, carrying the scent of judgment across the plains. By the time the fire died out, there was nothing left but ash, twisted metal, and silence. But word spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, bounty posters began showing up in nearby towns, not just for Elias Kane, but for Nayeli, Sierra, and Tama. Wanted for inciting rebellion. The ink was still drying when a rider from the county marshal's office arrived at the ranch. He didn't get far. Elias met him at the gate, rifle slung, eyes steel hard. "Turn your horse around," Elias said. "There's no bounty to collect here, only the truth." The man spat on the dirt. "This ain't justice you're building out here. It's defiance. You got that part right." The marshal didn't push, but he didn't leave empty-handed. He rode off with a message carved into his saddlebag, one Elias etched with his own knife. "We bury cowards. We don't bargain with them." The weeks that followed were uneasy. The rescued girls, some just children, were sheltered in the cabins near the orchard, guarded day and night by members of the tribe. Many didn't speak, didn't eat, just stared out the windows with eyes hollowed by memory. Tama sat with them, most often whispering old songs and weaving feathers into their hair. Every time she left the room, her hands shook. In the central barn, now converted into a council hall, the tribe met nightly to decide the path forward. And it wasn't just the sisters or the warriors anymore. Farmers, mothers, old men with missing teeth and broken knees. Survivors. They came not to follow Elias, but to stand with him. But with solidarity came danger. The governor issued a statement denouncing militant frontier factions. He stopped short of naming names, but everyone knew. The line had been drawn. And when the first shot came, it didn't come from a soldier or a mercenary. It came from a coward. One night, as the wind howled down from the hills, someone fired into the orchard. A single bullet, but it struck a 10-year-old girl in the thigh. She had been running with a wooden doll handmade by Tama the week before. The doll split in two. So did the silence. Elias and the sisters found the shell casing near the fence line. A hunting rifle, clean shot, the work of a marksman, and near the edge of the creek, carved into the bark of a cottonwood, was a symbol none of them had seen in years. A coiled rattlesnake impaled by a cross, Barlow's old insignia. Someone was resurrecting his ghost. That night, the fires were stoked higher. The scouts doubled their shifts. And Elias, for the first time in years, loaded the old shotgun he'd buried beneath his father's bed. Not because he feared an attack, but because he knew it was already here. He stood on the ridge at dawn, watching the horizon with the eldest sister at his side. Nayeli hadn't spoken since the orchard shooting, but her silence had sharpened. Her presence felt like thunder behind a mountain. "I should have killed Cartwright when I had the chance," Elias muttered. Nayeli shook her head. "Killing one man doesn't kill the rot." She was right. The rot had grown roots. By the next week, Elias received a summons, a federal court order. They were charging him with conspiracy, obstruction, and harboring fugitives. A trial date in the capital. He read it aloud in the central hall where every man, woman, and child could hear. No one blinked, no one wept. "We go with you," Sierra said. Elias looked around. If they want war through paper, we'll answer with fire, then walk into their courtroom with ash on our boots. So began the journey east, but they didn't travel light. 12 wagons, 17 tribal elders, dozens of women and children, not in defiance but in witness. They brought ledgers, harvest reports, tax receipts, and testimony from the rescued. They carried it all like sacred scripture. And on the third night, something unexpected happened. At the river crossing near Willow Pass, they found another group waiting. Sioux, Cree, Métis, families. Survivors from across the territories who had heard of the raid of the burned compound of Elias Kane and the three sisters who bled for girls no one else would save. They came not for protection but to walk with them. By morning, the convoy doubled. It stretched across the ridgeline like a scar of purpose. The courtroom would not expect this. They expected lawyers and letters. They would receive a procession, a march of those no longer silent. And at the front of it all, Elias, Nayeli, and two young girls wearing broken dolls on strings around their necks. It was not vengeance they carried now. It was something far more terrifying. A truth that refused to kneel. The courthouse in Redstone was built like a fortress, thick gray stone columns too large for a town this small, as if the architects had confused justice with intimidation. Inside, the air was cold despite the heat outside. Polished floors, walls lined with oil portraits of men who'd never left their desks. But what entered that day was not silence. It was thunder. The procession arrived at dawn. The sound of wagon wheels over cobblestone echoed like drums of judgment. Townsfolk peeked from behind curtains. Soldiers shifted nervously on the courthouse steps. What they saw was not an angry mob, but a community. Worn boots, children wrapped in deer hide, elders in full regalia, women carrying water jugs, grain sacks, and written testimony. At the head, Elias Kane flanked by Nayeli and Sira, and two girls who bore no scars on their skin but generations of them in their eyes. The judge tried to hide his surprise, but the defense lawyer didn't even pretend. "You brought a circus," he spat as Elias walked past. "No," Elias said. "We brought the truth. You just haven't seen it in a while." The courtroom filled quickly, more than the judge had planned for. There weren't enough benches, so people sat on the floor in the aisles, even on window ledges. The trial began the way they always did, by trying to shrink something enormous into tidy words: obstruction, trespassing, vigilantism. But when the prosecutor called the first witness, something shifted. They called Tama. She stood, slowly walked barefoot down the center aisle, her eyes scanning each man behind the benches like she'd memorized them in her nightmares. Her voice, when it came, didn't tremble. She told them everything: the cages, the girls, the nights without names, the brands that burned more than flesh. She did not weep, but the jury did. Then came the others. Girls with braids too short and wrists too thin. An old man who'd once been paid in bullets to bury runaways. A tribal mother who had carved the names of the lost into stone because no one else would write them. Each word a chisel, each testimony a hammer. By the time Elias stood, the silence was sacred. He didn't bring paper. He didn't wear a suit. Just his old hat and a coat older than the courthouse itself. "I was raised to believe justice was something you built," he said. "Turns out it was something you had to dig up from under the bones." He turned to the jury. "You can charge me. Hang me. Call me rebel or traitor, but you can't call me silent, not after what I saw." No one moved when he sat, not even the judge. That night, the jury deliberated for 6 hours, a record in Redstone. Some said it was because they were arguing. Others said they just needed time to cry. The verdict: not guilty. But that wasn't the end. After the trial, one of the rescued girls, Maris, only 8 years old, climbed the courthouse steps alone. She walked to the statue of the town's founder, a man who once signed the first bounty laws against tribal people, and laid a string of beads at its feet. Not as a gift, as a challenge. The photo of that moment made the front page of the Redstone Ledger. Underneath it, a new founding. In the weeks that followed, the federal office retracted its charges against the tribe. Investigations were opened against Barlow's remaining network. The land granted to the Ayani people was ratified in writing, not as a reservation, but as a sovereign community. And Elias? He refused to run for office. Refused interviews. He went back to his ranch, older now, but somehow lighter. He planted trees around the east field, one for each girl who'd been rescued. He never named them out loud. just whispered their stories to the leaves. Years later, when his body gave out during a summer storm, the sisters buried him at the fork of the river where he had nearly died so long ago and where the women first found him. Nayeli, now matriarch of the Ayani village, didn't cry. She knelt beside the grave, placed a stone pendant on the mound, and said simply, "He was the one who chose to remember." And in the schoolhouse built beside the field, children learn not only of cowboys and settlers, but of fire-lit caravans of courtrooms turned sacred, and of the man who gave back land not because he had to, but because no one else ever would. This wasn't just a story of survival. It was the beginning of a map. One not written on paper, but carved into the soil of a nation still learning how to listen. This story teaches us that justice is not always delivered by courts or carried out by lawmen. It often begins with one person refusing to stay silent. Elias Kane didn't act because he was a hero. He acted because silence had become unbearable. In a world where history buried the truth and pain was treated as collateral damage, Elias chose to remember to listen and to fight alongside the forgotten. The three sisters Nayeli, Sira, and Tama didn't survive by luck. They survived through resilience, through fire, and through a bond stronger than blood. They didn't seek pity, they demanded dignity. And in doing so, they showed an entire community what courage looks like when wrapped in silence and marked by scars. This story reminds us that healing can't happen without reckoning. That honoring the past isn't weakness, it's the only path to true change. And above all, it shows us that no culture, no people, no girl should ever be considered invisible. In a time when history is rewritten or ignored, remembering and choosing to act on that memory might be the most revolutionary thing a person can do. Justice begins where silence ends.